Germaine Greer, formidable feminist, feisty fighter, hugely enjoyable author, I think, teacher, academic, columnist, polemicist. Your new, rather serious book, Slipshod Sybils, says that women poets are self-destructive. Are they all?
Well, they're not all. The question is rather, are the ones who are valued the ones who make a display of self-destruction? And that takes us right back to the very beginning. That takes you back to Sappho and the belief that Sappho is a deviant, that she's a lover of women, but also, and at the same time, that she was dementedly in love with a mythological person called Phaon, who is clearly an avatar of Adonis, and that she threw herself off the Leucadian rock for love of him. And passionate interest in Sappho begins to develop in the 19th century around the myth of her self-destruction and her deviance. That's what they need from her. They don't need the fact that she wrote the greatest love poem possibly ever written, that has spawned every other love poem that ever was written. They don't want to know about that. They don't want to know about the generality of Sappho. They focus on her outsider status and her tragic self-destruction.
But you cite various women poets who have committed suicide, and you make that the core of your book, really.
Well, is it? Well, it's the end of the book, and it came about as a bit of a surprise to me, actually. I meant the ending to be kind of upbeat. Okay, guys, it's all different now. Now women poets can write poetry with the best of them. They get published, they get read. You know, if you go to any poetry reading around the country, you'll find as many women as men, and they're all holding their own and blah, blah. And then I thought, wait a minute, what rubbish? Because if you actually look, you'll see that the ones who've got the glamour status, the ones that undergraduates are reading, are Sylvia Plath, Anne Sexton. Virginia Woolf, a suicide herself, said that Charlotte Mew was the greatest woman poet. Poetess is actually the expression she used, alive in her time. And Charlotte Mew is a suicide. Anna Wickham is...
So why have there been so many suicides?
Well, Laura Riding has an answer to that question. It depends how seriously you take Laura Riding. I'm not prepared to take her unseriously. I think she's deluded in an important way, in a way that women poets tend to be deluded. And she said that if you try to domesticate the muse will try to kill herself. Now that's the basic lie. That's really what my book is about. Women are not muses, they're poets. And to inflict upon them the status of muse is to imply that their work will be spontaneous, that it will gush forth from them in some kind of divinely triggered stream. And what it gives you is a lot of poets who have no idea what they're doing, no idea how to make it better, and who, when they are rejected by the literary establishment, as they usually are with the onset of wrinkles and, you know, spreading waistline, then they don't know where to go. Then they really are at sea, because their poetic gift has been in some senses fraudulent, and it isn't an intellectual activity that will sustain them. But I ought to confess that I'm not actually a romantic. I mean, I belong to a line of wit. You know, I read Don Juan. I don't read Childe Harold, and that's the difference between me and a lot of other people who talk about poetry. I think Don Juan is a great poem, although apparently not serious, and that Childe Harold is a piece of virtuoso posturing by comparison.
Taking another line on the subject matter, though, because you've previously written a book about women painters, are you saying that women in our history, as writers or poets or women as painters, have had to face obstacles to their success and fulfillment? And are those obstacles external or internal?
Aha, well, success and fulfillment are not the same thing. Women poets have had a lot of success. The best-selling poet of the 19th century is Felicia Hemans. The best-selling, think about that, better selling than Wordsworth or Tennyson or Longfellow or whoever. Partly because she was marketed in two places. She was marketed in England, in Britain, and also in North America, in Canada and the United States. So she is being read by millions and millions of people, and she's now not being read by anyone. She is a success of fashion. She's an outer-directed success. And there is really not enough of a self-generated, self-regulating gift to enable her to make any sort of transition once taste changes. And if you look back at women poets, you see that lots of them danced on a wire for the entertainment of the multitude and crashed because they didn't know what they were doing. They weren't sustained even by the sort of poetic school that male poets instinctively build up. They instinctively make a kind of fellowship. And of course they compete with each other in the fellowship and they stab each other in the back, but they also listen to each other. They provide a proper sounding board. Most of the women are at the mercy of the people who are merchandising them, and they're actually being prostituted in a way. And they typically start writing very young. I forget who it was who's supposed to have started writing when she was 2. Somebody's work appeared on my desk the other day, began writing poetry when she was 2. Well, she began doing something when she was 2, but it wasn't writing poetry. It was maybe versifying, or maybe not even that. So you actually have this kind of, this strange sideshow of the poetic female, the muse incarnate. And she is always at the mercy of the male literary establishment, who will exploit her in any way that they find convenient.
And is that what drives some of them to suicide? What drives some of them to suicide?
I'm not sure. I can't. We've all got suicides in our friendship and our family, and we don't really know why they did it. And I am actually angry with people who kill themselves. I think they owe it to the rest of us not to do it. The rest of us are soldiering on. Just hang in there for a bit longer. I'm not very sympathetic to suicide. I don't see suicide as an act of grief or profound depression. I see it usually as an act of narcissistic manipulation and of deep hostility.
Do you think that view will offend some of those?
Oh, I know it will. I know it because it goes against all the current reverence. Also, my view of poetry will offend them too. I don't think poetry is the be-all and end-all of existence. I don't think a poet should flay herself the way Sylvia Plath said. You know, what a poet I will flay myself into. Sylvia, you flay yourself, you'll be a skinless person. You may be a skinless poet, or not, as the case may be. It shouldn't be necessary. We should want our poets with the skin on. Any culture that wants poets who have no skin is itself self-destructive and corrupt, I would argue.
Are you a writer with your skin on?
Well, my subject matter is not myself. Lots of people think that it is, but it isn't. I'm actually not interested in whether I'm happy or sad, for example. I don't wake up every morning and check my vital signs or my mood or anything. I generally wake up thinking there are things to do and set about doing them. And as long as my arms and legs work and my head doesn't spin, I do them. So I'm not forced to eviscerate myself as part of the spectacle. I tend to write about things that I can research. I tend to ask questions to which I want the answer. And generally I end up with a new set of questions, which may or may not be on the way to an answer. So I'm a different sort of writer. People say, why don't you write a novel? I won't write a novel. Why don't you write an autobiography? Even less likely to write an autobiography. I don't think there's a story there. I don't think it's interesting. I haven't got the artistic ego in that sense. And if I think of myself as a writer, it's more as an explainer.
Is your writing, is your work, which plainly has many different facets, is it all of a piece, or are there different yous?
Oh, there must be different me's. There are different everybodies. There's a daughter me, and there's a motherly me, and there's an old lady me, and there's a timeless me, I suppose. But is it all of a piece? I don't know. I would think so. I would imagine that people who care to could identify my style. In fact, I have a friend who wickedly seizes upon repetitive sentence structures in my work. This is a very sensitive reader, much more sensitive than the average reader, who will do me a typical Greer sentence, which he does for curative reasons to make me step out of that rut and go into another kind of expression. I'm trying something new at the moment, which I'm trying to write an opera, but the opera is not about me. The opera is about women's passion and the passion of the middle-aged women. Seeing as most divas are middle-aged, it strikes me as only fair that they could play something closer home than Juliet now and then.
Who's going to compose it?
Aha, wait and see.
You argue...
There is a composer.
You argue
But
for...
I don't want to commit him because I haven't warned him I'm about to make this statement.
Good luck. You argue for sorority among women writers. Are you part of a sisterhood or are you on your own?
It depends. A great many feminists define themselves by opposition to me, which is fine. And there are other people who don't, and who are quite happy to stand shoulder to shoulder with me. Even, they don't have to agree with me about everything, or indeed about anything, but they accord me my credentials and my status. I mean, I'm really moved when a major figure like Faye Weldon is asked, you know, who do you want to interview? And she says me. That's terrific. That keeps me breathing
But,
for a week.
Presumably, if contemporary feminism partly defines itself by opposition to you, then it's not so much a sisterhood as a catfight.
Why? Why? Why do people suppose that we should be like a nunnery and there should be Mother Superior who says, you know, you don't speak unless I give you permission? No, we're just a normal group. We're 51% of the population. We all come from different cultural, ethnic, class backgrounds. We have different educational qualifications. We have different fixes on what's going on. I don't choose to fight some battles. For example, I don't give a damn about the ordination of women. It's not a fight I want to fight. But I watch with great interest to see how the women fight that corner. And I think they do fantastically well. I'm not pro-abortionist. I don't even think that statement makes sense. You can't be pro-abortion. It's like being pro-amputation. But I do think that we need abortion. But I think we also need much better support systems for young women who may find themselves pregnant, and that most abortions are forced by the fact that if you go ahead and have a child, your life will just collapse and you'll go straight into the poverty classes, and all the possibilities of personal development will be shut down tight. And that strikes me as wrong, absolutely wrong. I think the state should support every child that is conceived in Britain today should be supported by the state. Now, lots of feminists would not agree with that at all, and they come from different positions. Likewise, people don't agree with me that rape is a sexist category and that it should be abolished, because the whole weight of historical definition of rape is intensely sexist and sees the woman as in the ownership of men, either of her father or her brothers or her spouse. They want to argue fiercely for rape as a really horrible, special kind of crime, and I think there's no future in doing that. And we'll keep on debating the issue, because that's the only way we'll find out what we're really talking about, because we have to remake all these categories, you see.
You wrote recently that you were raped at the age of 19. Why did you wait so long to write that?
Oh, why did I write about it ever? I don't write about the disasters in my life. If I fill my galoshes full of boiling water when I'm straining pasta, I don't instantly reach for the headlines, you know. If I have a car crash, I hope that doesn't end up in the headlines.
This was something which relates to a very live political issue.
Quite. Well, the thing was that I was arguing that anonymity it's a condescending category. I hate the idea that if you're going to bring a charge against a man for which he may go down for 3 to 5 years or longer, that you won't sign your name to it. You won't stand there and do it. I want to see the angry woman. I want to see the outraged woman saying, that man did that to me. To make her anonymous strikes me as just going in the wrong direction. Because what I want is for women to say, yes, I've been raped and I'm not ashamed. It's not my shame that I've been assailed in this way. Why should I be creeping about anonymous? And I thought, if I'm going to argue that, then it seems to me I have to come out as someone, because you have to consider that everyone would say, well, what does she know about it? You know, she's never been raped. She doesn't know how raped women feel, blah, blah, blah. Oh, yes, I do. And here is my story. And ironically, what happened after that is that the Australian papers, unbeknownst to the English papers, had an absolute field day. They went mad. And one of the things, everything they wrote was actionable, practically. But, I mean, they live in a world of their own, and who's going to bother? But one of the things they said was, we know all about this. Greer's been talking about this rape for years. Oh, we all know about the famous rape. news to me, mate. Apparently somebody put it in a book. A book printed in Australia had my rape as part of its story. Nobody asked me. I knew nothing about it.
How did you react at the time, though?
When?
When you were raped? I mean, did you keep it to yourself, or did you talk it about?
Well, I didn't keep it to myself. It was a bit impossible to keep it to myself, actually. First of all, I was picked up by people in the street in shock, and I was taken home. The men I'd gone to the party with lived in this flat. I was in a tricky situation. I was living in the maid's room in a flat that was really in the possession of 3 very handsome men about town, and they would have all assumed that I was, you know, their sort of professional masseuse, I think. So that was a bit tricky. But they all knew, and everybody knew who it was because he was one of their circle, and they knew that he was a nutter. And I just couldn't believe that these men who knew this guy was a nutter were sort of taking him to parties and knowing what he was likely to do. But that changed after this because they were really angry because they felt protective towards me. Again, the same thing. It was the men decided to believe me and to discipline the other man. Now, this is the real problem when it comes to rape. Whether the confederacy of men with women is greater than the instinctive confederacy of men with men, and normally it isn't. I was lucky in that case that they believed me and they took steps to see that I was, in some sense, avenged for this outrage. But for my part, I thought it was a bit like being on the bus stop and being hit by a runaway car. I mean, I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. And I thought that what I had to do was damage limitation. I had to keep steady as I went, that if I really let this get to me, I would be good for nothing. I had to get over it. It was one of the worst years of my life. I had a really tough time. I'd left home. I had no idea how I was going to survive, really. And to suddenly be slammed by this was awful. But I was helped, and I helped myself. I've had a lot of interesting letters about being raped. I had an extraordinary one from a woman who said, you know, that she just went into a sort of trance and waited for it to be over. And all the time she was saying to herself, it's not happening. It can't happen if I don't let it happen. Which doesn't mean that the penis doesn't end up in the vagina. It means it doesn't end up in me, if you see what I mean. And that's important too. You have to say, you stick your finger up my nose, you have assaulted me, but you haven't corrupted me or polluted me in any way. Well, it's the same with the penis. You know, the one part of a man I know how to deal with is his penis, and I won't be told that it's my enemy. It is my only friend in the masculine world.
Where were you born?
I was born in the Mercy Hospital in East Melbourne.
Who was your mother?
My mother was Margaret Mary LeFranc. I think she was almost 21.
What sort of person was she?
She was striking, innocent, eccentric, intelligent.
Very eccentric?
Very.
Dotty?
Dotty sounds nicer than what it is. It's more...
How was she eccentric?
Well, my mother is alive and defining herself. I don't really want to reduce her to some counter in my life. I think my mother was cruelly played upon in some ways. She won a scholarship to have exactly the same education that I had. She won the same scholarship I won. But she wanted a glamorous existence rather than an academic existence. So she ditched it and became an apprentice to a milliner, which was kind of stupid because she had much more going on in her head. But she was seduced, like a lot of my mother's generation, by a kind of Lana Turner dream of glamour. That was where the real future was. It was Bobby Soxers, Frank Sinatra, going to Woolworths to listen to the music. And the dream was that I'm going to be a singer. Everybody knew how to croon. And it was very much like, I can't ever remember the name of that film. Is it called Distant Voices, Other Lives or something? Mm-hmm. You know the film I mean, where everybody's life is spelled out in terms of the songs they sang. My mother was very much like that. But there was much more to her than that. She has fantastic energy. And because it had no external focus, it has become destructive of her and people around her. My father knew exactly what game to play with this girl, with her dreams of glamour, and he sort of came on his Basil Rathbone act, and she fell for it completely. And she still doesn't believe that my father married her under an assumed name. Still doesn't believe that he was an illegitimate child brought up by poor people in Launceston. I think she still wants to believe that he was a kind of remittance man who was connected to powerful and rich people in England. And that's fine. You know, why should she not believe that?
Who was your father?
My father never knew his own name, which I think is really sad. My father's real name, his given name at the baptismal font was Richard Robert Ernest Hamilton King. His mother's name was Rhoda King. She was the daughter of a Lincolnshire immigrant who came when he was a boy, and probably a convict's child. And I think she was probably working as a servant in the house of Richard Robert Ernest Hamilton, and she got pregnant to him and had the baby, and the baby was given up immediately for adoption. But before she did that, he was baptized. And I just can't imagine how the celebrant allowed her to write that name and the name of his father in the register, because they didn't do that normally when servant girls had their babies baptized.
You were born just before the war, and he went off to the war. Was he an absent father or a present father?
Even when he was there, he was an absent father. He couldn't deal with me. He could with my brother, maybe with my sister too, but not with me. And I think that was probably because of the kind of child I was.
Which was what sort of child?
I'm not sure, but I think I was rather censorious, very highly strung, and unsparing. I think he couldn't meet my gaze. I think I was the only one of the children who really wanted to know who he was. And he couldn't answer that question because he'd forgotten. It's been explained to me by people who deal with people who make themselves up a new personality, that they forget the old one. So my father knew he couldn't answer my question. And he let me believe wrong things. And it's typical of me that I would make him into a hero and an aristocrat when he was just a bloke.
And you've told us this story in a wonderful book, Daddy, We Hardly Knew You. Did he love you?
Oh, well, how would I know? I don't know. If somebody never kisses you and never says, I love you, how do you know? Women are always telling themselves that men who break their jaws every Saturday night are in love with them. And we're always ready to believe that we're loved when we're not, when we're barely tolerated. But there was a wonderful thing that was in one of the psychologist's reports on him after the war, when he was really swinging the lead. You know, he was trying to get himself a cushy life in Civvy Street after the war, and the reputation of a hero at the same time. And he was very adroitly manipulating these psychologists, but he did tell them that he had a recurrent dream of cars driving at his little daughter. And he only had one little daughter, and that was me. And if that was his nightmare...
You were a little daughter?
Yes, I was as little as any other baby, believe me. I was little until I had to stand on the 6 phone books to sing the descant in Beethoven's Creation's Hymn when I was 13. So I was one of those children who was normal size and then suddenly went... Whoosh.
What sort of education did they give you?
The nuns gave it to me.
And
I was educated by demented Irish nuns, all crazy and all wonderful. And they taught me about pleasure, which isn't supposed to be their subject. But they did. I mean, they taught me about music. They taught me about painting. They taught me about everything that was fun. Home was the place where there was just washing up. School was a place where there was absolute bliss.
What did Australia do for you?
Made me no respecter of rank, which is tantamount to being an aristocrat. If you don't know who to pull your forelock to, you behave with natural arrogance, which I've always found a great asset.
When you came to Britain, did you find us all pulling our forelocks?
Yes, but every Australian feels that. The the shock of discovering a class system, which was one of the things that crushed my father. And my father was in the RAF, and he'd pulled his little toff act in Australia with great effect. And he was one of the first men ever to sell advertising in Australia. He drove a car. He was, you know, very glamorous and very impressive character. And of course, he ends up in the RAF mess, and they pretty soon discover that he's just a trumped-up little poseur, big poseur. And I think that was hard for him to cope with. So when I came here, the first thing I noticed was that people seemed so ill, so sort of spindly. I was used to big, strapping brown people, and here all these greyish pink people. That was a bit of a shock. And I remember trying to buy a pair of blue suede gloves. And this is the kind of thing. And I said, "Can I see some blue suede gloves, please? Navy blue suede gloves." And the woman said, "They're very expensive." I thought, the impudence. She obviously thought I shouldn't have them.
Well, in spite of the sales lady and the class system, you stayed.
Yes. Basically because of the proximity of Europe. Australia's just too far away.
Many Australians, or anyway several remarkable Australians of something like your generation, have come here together with you. I mean, I'm thinking of Richard Neville and Clive James, I suppose, and Barry Humphries and Robert Hughes. I mean, am I imagining it, or was there something that you sort of combined to inject into us a bit of different vitality? I don't know.
I'm probably the wrong person to ask that. I don't know what it was about us. I think it was partly this natural arrogance. We did think there was nothing that we couldn't understand and nothing that we couldn't find out, and just went for it all the time. Whereas I remember being shocked at Cambridge that people weren't genuinely interested in the subject. I tried to arrange an anti-seminar, because we'd had one in Sydney, that we were taught the sort of official leave-a-site line at that time. And I thought, okay, fine, there's another way of regarding all of this. In fact, there's lots of other ways. So we used to just buy a few flagons of red and argue the night away. We'd have our official seminar, then we'd talk all night long, and at the end of the night, some of us had clearer ideas and some of us were more confused. But it was worth doing because we really cared about the subject. I tried to do the same thing in Cambridge, and people said things like, "Will we get course credit?" the Americans said. I said, "Are you joking? There's more to life than course credit." And the English asked, "Will any of the academics be there? Will anybody from the faculty be there?" Of course not. The whole point is they mustn't be there. Oh, well, in that case, you know, we want to be seen doing this enthusiastic thing. We don't actually want to do it. It was impossible. I couldn't do it. I had to give up all effort.
The 60s is supposed to have been a decade of sexual liberation. Was it for you?
Well, I'm a Puritan in one way. I decided when I was 16 that I wasn't going to be able to date. But I just couldn't do it. The idea that some boy would buy me a ticket to something, a dance or the pictures, or take me out to dinner, and then we would park somewhere in the car on the way home, and then I would decide how much he could have in return for the outlay. I know it's not supposed to be like that, but well, at least I'm told it's not supposed to be like that, but that's how it seemed to me. And I decided that I would never, ever kiss any man on the lips unless I had already decided that I would go to bed with him, which meant I didn't kiss anybody. It meant when everyone else was petting and they had 10 years of foreplay, I was stomping around being a sexual revolutionary, going the whole way in terror and dread, because we had no decent contraception. It was very frightening. Going the whole way and having very little pleasure in doing it for lots of reasons. We were inept and I was frightened and all of that, but it was what we were supposed to be doing because we were all reading D.H. Lawrence, and you had to, you know, you couldn't have sex in the head. You had to have proper sex. God knows where that lives in D.H. Lawrence. I now think D.H. Lawrence is steaming rubbish, I have to say, especially on such subjects. It's good on Australia. Kangaroo's a good book, but Women in Love is full of rubbish. So I was a sexual revolutionary then, but I paid a very high price for it.
What was the price?
Oh, lots of prices. I mean, there was an abortion when I was still a child, and there were, Did you have to manage that yourself? Yes. I insisted on managing it myself. I wouldn't ask.
How old were you?
I was 19, same annus horribilis. And I mean, I couldn't be bothered explaining this in other circumstances, but what actually happened was I knew that the man who had made me pregnant was in love with somebody else. So there was no point, there was no way I was going to hold him to any kind of dishonourable bargain that he should support my child or anything like that. And I would have had to leave school, and my whole life would have collapsed. So it was my mistake. I wasn't misled by anybody. I misled myself, and so I paid for it. But it was heartbreaking, and then a lot of other things came from that, because I then tried to use contraception, and the only thing available was a Grafenberg ring. Now, nobody remembers what that was, but my subsequent problems, which were dire, were caused by this grim piece of early German contraceptive technology. And
dire physical problems.
Oh, yes. I mean, I won't bore you with it. I'm accused of talking about my womb all the time. In fact, I never talk about it, and I don't intend to talk about it now. But rather than saying that my subsequent infertility was the result of abortions, it was actually a result of my valiant attempts to practice some sort of contraception.
Even though you'd explored all this the hard way before you got here, you were carrying a banner, weren't you, in the 60s?
Oh, yes.
Posing nude and editing Suck.
The banner I was carrying was to the real sexual revolution would be the overthrowing of sadism, the extirpation of sadism and power relations from sex, and the concentration on mutual pleasuring. That would have been a revolution, but it didn't happen. Sadism is still the dominant pattern of Western sexuality.
You reckon?
I know. I mean, just have a look at what's on the top shelf in the newsagent.
I would have thought that, and I think you've written that the idea of pleasurable sex had spread and was bigger. I mean, after goodness, people must always have known about pleasurable sex.
Well, if we're going to be if you want to investigate the extent to which we've become capable of pleasurable interaction that is not connected with power, then a very simple thing to do would be to look at cultural practices with regard to oral sex, especially in England. Blowjobs are normal. Girls do them all the time. A lot of the time to get out of trouble, to get out of a compromising situation. It's oral sex the other way round. Men performing cunnilingus in England. Forget it. They still hate it. Even the most doggedly womanizing of men don't really go for it at all. Now, if you step across the channel, or indeed if you step into black society, completely different set of priorities, completely different approach to pleasuring each other. Englishmen still think that their pleasure is a woman's pleasure. They've still got this idea that as long as they're having a good time, provided the woman is normal, she's having a good time too.
I've heard of one chap who better be nameless who calls himself the Nijinsky of cunnilingus.
We all know who he is, but that's probably all he can manage these days, wouldn't you say?
You were very briefly married. Have you ever... Why did it last such a short time? And
because I wasn't meant to be married, basically.
have you ever thought of trying again?
No. I didn't try then, actually. The truth is I didn't try. It was a sort of mock marriage. I think I probably married that particular man because I knew. It was, but did I really? I'm not sure. I mean, I knew by the time I was marrying him that it was a mistake. I was in tears the whole day about doing it, but I'd said I would do it, and this is part of my Puritanism. I'd said I would do it, and that meant I had to do it. I couldn't just say, excuse me, but this is all wrong. I knew it was all wrong, but I did it just the same, which was stupid.
Do you regret not having children?
You know, when people ask that question, I don't know what they think having children is.
Well,
I regret the fun you can have
you
from
said
babies.
earlier that there was a daughter you and a mother you.
Yeah, yeah.
What does the mother you get up to?
She mothers things and
Things.
people and animals and, oh yes, I mean my mother knew that about me when I was an elder sister, remember, so I did a lot of mothering as a child. I mothered my sister and my brother. And when my mother found me living with a man in Sydney, when he walked in the door, and he turned out to be a longshoreman, a docker, My mother said, "Oh, I'm so glad. I thought it'd be somebody you were mothering." There's been a lot of men I've mothered in my time as well. But the thing about having a child is I've watched my girlfriends suffering through their children. How would I feel now if I had a 20-year-old with no job, no prospects, problems with drugs, probably, because they're all over the place, and if you've got no other option, no other excitement, how would I feel? I mean, I'd be worrying all the time. The last thought when I went to bed at night would be about my child and my child's problem. The other thing is that I would probably be the sort of mother who occupies her child's universe, who makes wonderful things happen for the child, so the child never gets free. I mean, I have girlfriends who have children like that, who are dazzled by their mothers because their mothers are wonderful. And when it comes to finding ordinary boyfriends and girlfriends, it's just kind of not the same, because mum makes things happen. I would have had I probably would have had more capacity for misery come to me through a child than joy. If the child does well, you know, it's down to the child. If the child does badly, it's down to you as a parent. That's the way society has set up that equation. So I think that it would have been wonderful to have had a child of my own loins, but it's pretty wonderful being involved with other people's children in a way that is less painful. So, you know, if one of my godchildren comes to me and says, I had sex in the summer holidays with a ski coach, and I didn't like it very much, and but now I've got a problem. It hurts down below. I mean, if I was a mother, I'd go mad. And I think, Christ, my child's whole life has been ruined by some bastard on the ski slope, so I'll get him, I'll kill him. But as it's me, we just sort it, don't we? And it means the child can tell me, because I don't get so upset. I don't get into my heart doesn't break when my child tells me something like that, because it's a godchild. I like that relationship. It's less gut twisting. I asked my sister once whether she ever dreamt that she could suffer, that I asked her if any lover had ever made her suffer as much as she has suffered through one of her children. And she said, "You have to be joking." It's limitless, a mother's pain. And we're very good at pain, and we can't claim much pleasure, especially when the children get big. You know, you can't even ring up the police when your child is 18 and you know he's gone storming out of the house with a gut full of some vile chemical and he's driving the car. You can't even ring up the police and say, "My son has just gone out in my car."
What's the next big thing in your life?
Well, the publication of Slipshod Sybils is going to be a bit of a problem. I'm going to have to climb very gingerly over that. And I've got a book on women and health to do. And right now I'm just concerned about the dog's haircut next week. I mean, one day at a time. Very important the doggies aren't made to look foolish.